All right, welcome to Western Water and Wildlife Adaptive Private Land Management. This is Rebecca Briesmoore.
This is Savannah Adkins.
This is Connor Flora.
I'm Brennan Bloyd.
I'm Brennan Jordan, and
We're the Brennans. Thank you for laughing. We really tried to get that delivery down. So get us started. Climate change is not a future problem. It's affecting communities across the globe and putting a strain on our degrading landscapes. Accompanied by persistent drought, our landscapes are drying up, resulting in a cascade of damages across the American West. State and federal agencies manage public lands for ecosystem health and mitigate against climate change. However, private lands are equally impacted by these changes and have varying levels of support and different management strategies based on their land use. The ecosystem services our properties provide, such as wildlife habitat, nutrient cycling, and water purification, do not have to be compromised by private land ownership. Finding a balance between the goals of the property and environmental health is paramount to our projects and centered around understanding the resources of the land. Our projects work on private property showcases the flexibility and experimentation that these properties provide to develop better land management practices to result in greater community resilience.
So our panel today is going to start in Powderhorn, Colorado with Rebecca and Connor and myself, but we're going to do that later. So Powderhorn, Colorado is located about 30 miles southwest of town here. The parcels that we're working on, it's actually 5 different parcels in one valley. It totals about 900 acres. It has Highway 149 to the south, and then kind of runs south to north. Goose Creek Spring is right next to Highway 149 on that south end, and it runs into Goose Creek proper, and that goes through all of those properties. There is past grazing on the properties, and the north end of the property still grazes. However, the south end does not. The landowners are mostly curious about water, wildlife, and potential restoration on their properties. And then going to Brennan and Savannah's property, that's going to be the Cold Harbor property, about 8 miles east on Highway 50 from Gunnison. That one's a 334-acre parcel, 234 acres of which is under a wetland reserve program easement under the NRCS. This property also hosts the confluence of Tamichi and Cochito Creeks. The traditional use on that land has been development, grazing, and agriculture. But Brennan and Savannah's project aims to enhance water resources through wetland and stream restoration. And now we're going to go and transition to Rebecca, and we're going to talk about.
Thank you, Brennan. So my project is creating a piece of a land management plan for private land near Powderhorn, Colorado. And before starting a land management plan, the most important thing to understand is the vital component of water, which is what my project focuses on. So as Brennan mentioned, my project is located near Powderhorn. This is 30 miles-ish southwest of Gunnison, directly south of Blue Mesa Reservoir. And we're working on a bunch of different parcels of land that include about 900 acres total that is owned by 2 separate landowners. Connor and Brennan and I are all working on this project, and we all have different aspects that we're looking into. Eventually, we're going to create recommendations and project plans for these landowners and create an all-encompassing land management plan with each of our different project areas. So what we're interested in primarily is what the landowners are interested in. They are the owners of the properties, and they get to decide what they're looking to see on their land and what their goals and interests are. In the focus area of water, which is my area, they have 2 different goals. And the first one is just to understand the movement of water on their property. This includes both how much water is available, but also when it is available. It really depends on snowmelt and seasonal water. And then also they're also looking at where is the water coming from? Is it a groundwater source? They have a bunch of seeps on their land. And then, or is it a surface water source? So trying to quantify what that is, where it's coming from and how much. Okay, so to do this, to figure out how much water is available on the property, we have to be out on the property and observing and documenting what is happening. So starting in April, when Connor and I got this project, we started going out there weekly to measure water flows at different locations on the property, including the inlets and the outlets, to determine how much water there was and to develop a hydrograph for the property. We also collected some water quality data, and we're also just monitoring what the landowners are currently doing with the water, what their land management plan is currently, and then also looking at some groundwater levels by installing PVC pipes. And then also one of the landowners has created like test holes, and so we're just monitoring the water level for that. The second goal that the landowners are interested in is using the water resources they have on their property for different goals. So one landowner has a bunch of yaks, a yak herd with some really cute baby yaks this spring, and they use the water for irrigation to create pasture land. So they want to maintain their water resources and utilize that water to create pasture grazing for these yaks. And then both landowners are really interested in using their water resources to create habitat and attract wildlife. This is a property that's pretty dry. It's especially one of them. It's pretty limited for water resources, especially with the ongoing drought that we have now. And so developing ways to effectively use their water and managing their water is key to getting their goals accomplished on these properties. So to meet this second goal, I will be creating a list of recommendations that I have for their properties to meet their goals. And then the landowners can look at that list and choose what they're interested in pursuing. I'll take the recommendations they're interested in and develop that into a project that they can implement on their landscape. And then work with stakeholders like NRCS, Trout Unlimited, and local ranchers and landowners who have experience in these areas to develop a plan for them as part of the water aspect of our Powderhorn land management plan. And now I'm going to pass it off to Connor, who's going to talk about the habitat aspect.
I'm Connor Flora, and I'm finding a balanced land management strategy focused on habitat improvement. The question I've been tasked with answering is, how do you meet the needs of landowners who are ranchers, hunters, nature enthusiasts? Finding the balance between these needs is difficult. The first step in meeting this difficult challenge is building a relationship with the landowners by understanding their goals and building trust. So with two landowners, two different properties, that means there's two sets of goals. Finding these goals and determining what they are is very important. But the broad goal of my project is to identify wildlife and livestock habitats and then find ways to improve them. But for the ranch that's more concerned with ranching, the goal is to identify solutions for continued yak ranching while improving wildlife habitat. And this is a really exciting opportunity because I think there's a way to meet both of these goals at the same time. The other property is not as focused on ranching. And this is also exciting because that means there's a lot more resources that can be used for wildlife habitat improvement. So to do this effectively, I need to understand what the resources are on the land and how to use them effectively in the 1 year that I have. Like all of the basin, drought has and will continue to affect these landowners and will impact the recommendations I'll be able to make in the next year. But by modeling how this will impact the area, these ranches, I can make recommendations that are more accurate and more dynamic in the future so that they can be used after I'm gone. To do this effectively, I need to understand the perspectives of each rancher, but also I need to continue progressing this by reaching out to neighbors, agencies, academics that have experience with these goals and have successfully met them in the past. So far, Rebecca and I have taken some steps to create a map of where these areas are. We've done this with the help of Dr. Phil Crosley and Dr. Michael Russell. with their experience using drones to collect remote data, or remote sensing data. You can see the large map right there. And what this allows us to do is identify areas where improvements can occur. It kind of narrows down the 900 acres of property to a much smaller area that we can focus in 1 year. So if you look at the inset image here to the right, you can see a very clear line between wetland and upland habitat. That green area, that's wetlands. That's where I'm going to focus my improvements. And these improvements will be focused or will be influenced by the data I collect, the individuals I meet, and the interests of the landowners. For now, I'm focusing on applying low-tech structures that will improve these habitats by diverting water, slowing it down, spreading it out, like some of the other students have talked about today. But this isn't all that's been done on the property. The landowners have taken really impressive steps on their own to meet their goals. And so by building upon this, we hope to continue to improve this habitat with the work Brennan and Rebecca and I are going to be doing. With these combined efforts, I'm confident that I'll be able to deliver a balanced land management strategy that will enable these landowners to continue to meet their goals. Next, Brennan will talk about his project at Cold Harbor.
Thank you, Connor. I'd like to start off by saying this is a legacy project, and all of me and Savannah's work is really designed to be continued by our first year. So if you guys are interested, please do contact me or Savannah or reach out to MJ. There are opportunities for first years to get involved with fellowships or just kind of anything that Cold Harbor has going on. So again, I'm Brennan Bloyd, and I am the project manager for the Cold Harbor Institute, implementing an adaptive wetland restoration plan. To give a little background, the Cold Harbor Institute is a nonprofit aimed to demonstrate regenerative laboring practices that bring health to our body, land, and community. If you want to go to the next slide, please. The Cold Harbor Ranch is located 8 miles east of Gunnison on 334 acres, 234 of which are on a wetland reserve program easement. That easement requires that we're improving or maintaining our current wetlands. It also restricts some of the activities that we're able to do on the ranch to protect those water resources. For an example of that is we can't graze or have groups of more than 3 people out on the property in between March 15th and July 15th. So how this project kind of got started was a previous fellow, Catherine Bickley. She went out on the property with the Cold Harbor Institute and cataloged what water resources we have, what our river and wetland ecosystems are looking like. She then developed and kind of gathered what we're calling our restoration committee that accounts for partners from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Resource Conservation Service, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Cold Harbor Institute, Trout Unlimited, Western Faculty, and the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservation District. Together with that technical assistance by the restoration committee, they cataloged our wetland resources and found opportunities for restoration, as well as developed alternatives to pursue within the goals of the property and the project. So the overall goals of the project are 1, to enhance current wetlands, 2, improve fish and wildlife habitat, 3, reduce stream bank erosion and threats to infrastructure. And that's for each of the phases. Phase 2 and 3 are primarily focused on in-stream river restoration as well as wetland restoration. And phase 1 has been my focus over this summer and my implementation. And that's primarily focused on wetland restoration. If you want to go next. So what the heck did I do this summer? I did a more in-depth catalog of our water resources. I did this through flow measurements as well as drone imagery throughout the summer to see how the water and the landscape changes and kind of get a better idea of what our needs are of the property and what wetland opportunities of improvement there are. With 2 partners, primarily Brandon Miller with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Dan Olson, we went out on the property with multiple site visits and developed what alternatives best fit the goals of the property and the scope of the project, specifically within phase 1. After developing those alternatives, we convened more restoration committee members for another site visit and decided to what alternatives were best for our property. And we ended up deciding to implement beaver dam animal lung structures along the Jennings-Elson ditch outlined on that north side of the structure. And that is intended to kind of extend that flood irrigation that we have and improve the current wetland habitat. We also want to put a postless BDA right there south of Tamichi to really increase the attenuation time of water within the southern oxbow. There's also a historic irrigation ditch that we plan to fill to improve some sheet flow. And we recently had a cultural resource survey done on the property, and the only thing they found was the historic railroad grade. So we're just waiting for NRCS approval for that in order to implement. Something that's also holding up implementation is our current compatible use authorization agreement with NRCS under our WRP easement. That the language within that agreement is currently prohibitive of the action items we are able to do. We're having a meeting next week to try to get that figured out and see if we're able to implement anything come this fall. So what my project is kind of transitioning to come fall is developing a new compatible use authorization agreement that really encompasses what we want to do within the full scope of this project, not only within phase 1, but also phase 2 and 3, and really provide, not lock us down into one alternative specifically, but provide the flexibility that we need to really pursue the goals of Cold Harbor. My work, along with Savannah Adkins, we are developing an adaptive wetland management program, and her monitoring really inform those metrics of future management strategies. And with that, I'll pass it on to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Brennan. I'm Savannah Adkins, and as he said, I'm also working with the Cold Harbor Institute as a fellow to develop an adaptive wetland monitoring protocol to help inform future restoration projects and to assess the impacts of phase 1 restoration. Next slide. I will be focusing on 4 main components of data collection that will make up the adaptive management framework. Soil moisture will be measured to assess the overall health of the wetland and surrounding water table to see if the necessary nutrients are present within the soil. We will utilize line intercepts to track the influences on vegetation after restoration that affect the hydrology and the sediment regimes within the ecosystem. The water quality will also be tested to prevent point and non-point pollution sources from affecting the property. And the goal is for the restoration work to improve the water quality so a healthy wetland habitat can thrive. I will also be installing wildlife cameras around the restoration site to assess the presence of wildlife. We want to create a regenerative habitat area where migrating and local species can contribute to the overall ecosystem health. The adaptive monitoring protocol will be able to work with the landscape. And by that, I mean the protocol will adapt with the impacts of restoration work and will inform future phases with the positive influences that we find. The mosaic of this landscape is so unique, it is essential to monitor the assistance to resiliency that we provide to the landscape. Next slide. Here are 2 photos taken on the property. This first one right here was taken in early May, and this middle one right here was taken in late May. So in only a couple weeks, you can see the drainage ditch retains water fairly well and has the properties of wetland that we want to expand. The photo on the right was taken on the south end of the restoration site and is one of the locations Brennan and I have and will be continuing to collect water quality data. So through restoration, we will expand wetland features across the property, and through monitoring, we will be able to quantitatively know what works best for the property and what doesn't, providing Cold Harbor with a protocol that they can follow for multiple years that this project requires. And now I will pass it off to Brennan, who will take us back up to Powderhorn to talk about wildlife importance in private land management.
All right, back to Powderhorn. So my section of the Powderhorn project is going to be a working wildlife inventory for the landowners. My hope is to provide them with information about what animals are using their landscapes, how they're using those landscapes, and how that landscape use changes throughout the year. And it also will inform restoration potential, that if Rebecca and Connor find a wetland or 2 that are worth restoring, but mule deer don't hang out at one of the wetlands, the landowners may opt to restore the wetland that mule deer are more apt to use. To gather this data, I will be utilizing camera traps, so trail cameras spread throughout the property. I'm lucky in that I'm not using these camera traps for numerical data, so I can just put them wherever I deem fit. The landowners already had some camera traps deployed, which is really nice. So I was able to use their recommendations and recommendations from my partners and other people on the property, along with my personal observations to see where the animals were hanging out, seeing where tracks were. And as well, if you can't find any of those things, water is always a great place to look. Next slide, please. So on this side here, this is a map of the properties. We can see that there are actually 6 different properties, or 5 different properties spread out from north to south. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see where I've placed the camera traps. The white dots here are where I have camera traps already deployed, and the blue spots are where I hope to deploy them in the future. And these spots can change depending on what wildlife shows up. So kind of segueing into that, the landowners had purchased the property with hunting in mind. Unit 66 is one of the premier mule deer and elk units in the state of Colorado. But as they have stayed on the property longer and enjoyed it, their focuses have changed. Mule deer and elk and moose are still ungulates of importance, but there's a more holistic want for wildlife on the property. Next slide, please. Perfect. So yeah, like I said, the priority animals are going to be like mainly mule deer. As you can see here, there are a bunch of mule deer that use the property all year long. There are resident and migratory. My observations has been a group of about a dozen does that just likes to hang out on the south end of the property most of the year so far. But again, like I said, we do have some elk that migrate through. For some reason, I could only get her butt. Her butt showed up on like 2 different cameras in 2 different places, which is pretty funny. And the one cool thing too is there was the property was previously grazed on that south end, but the landowner stopped that about 2 years ago and spread a native seed mix. And since then, this year, a bachelor group of 4 pronghorn antelope had made their way up 9 Mile to the property, and they were using it as a home base because there was really good feed, really good water, and they would go out to different areas around the property, next to the property, and come right back to bed down next to the house. And also, does anybody want to take a stab at the scariest thing I've ever caught on the trail camera? Anybody? Snowshoe hare. Like they'd run really fast, so they're always really blurry. Scary. But the snowshoe hare is fantastic because this is another indicator species for a species of concern for the entire state of Colorado. That's the Canada lynx. The property owners had previously been looking to shoot bobcats on the property for predator management. But now that there's the potential for snowshoe or for Canada lynx to be on the property, that's not the best idea. So they're changing their practices with as they're informed with the fauna on their property. And kind of continuing on with predators, you can see we got a coyote kind of digging down in the snow there. So they utilize the property, that valley in the winter time. And then there's also bears and mountain lions in the BLM land. So lots of different animals to kind of keep stock. And behind that picture there, that lake, there's a this is more of an impoundment, but I had pictures of that frozen solid, and then the day after that unfroze, waterfowl came in, goose, ducks came right in and plopped their butts in. So it's a very large breadth of fauna on the property that the landowners are just curious for their own sake to have an active working inventory of what animals are on their property throughout the year. And also it will help inform the potential restoration. Yeah, I very much look forward to providing that to the property owners and working with Connor and Rebecca to give them great land recommendations. Yeah, absolutely. So this is how our projects have showcased Western water and wildlife. We can mitigate the effects of climate change by utilizing the flexibility of private land for coexisting land use. So the last thing I want to say, we're trying to do these projects in such a way that it will set up first years with projects next year. If you're interested in wetlands or water or wildlife, please come talk to us. We want to try to keep some cohesion through the MEM program. So thank you. Questions?
We have time for probably 3 or 4 questions if they're pretty quick. Do you want to start?
Sure, I just have a really quick question for you, Brennan. You got a cat picture on this?
Oh, yes. No, that's so that's Bob. She is the resident ranch cat. She's very good at catching chipmunks, and she eats better than I do. And Alyssa, is she in Texas now? Is Alyssa here? No.
Yes,
Never
she
mind.
is.
But I think she might be moving to Texas for a little bit, but she'll be back. Don't worry.
I have a question for Rebecca. What methods are you going to use to take your flow measurements and water level measurements on the test hole?
Yeah, so we have a really basic flow.
Repeat the question.
Yes, the question was, what are we using to measure water on the property for both groundwater and surface water? We have a really basic flow measurement tool that we've been using through the ENVS college to do the weekly flow data. And then for the groundwater measurements, it's a little bit more tricky. As I mentioned, one of the landowners just kind of went out and dug a hole to try to figure out the water level beneath the wet meadow area. But we'd like to install that method in a few other places using PVC pipes, which is a bit less of a large area impact and a more just one kind of pinprick into the land to measure what that ground level water is.
This is kind of a question, I guess, for everybody, but how did accessing the private land impact your studies? Because it's a great story of private landowner was working with you. So did you want to work somewhere else, but you weren't able to because people didn't want you on the property? How would that kind of impact other studies? Just kind of like talking about that access point.
So in terms of the Powderhorn one, we were asked to come onto the property. We were not soliciting that. It was the two landowners being interested in having people develop a plan for them. And then we interviewed with the landowners and were selected for the project.
The Cold Harbor property is kind of unique in the sense that it's owned by a nonprofit that really has a great partnership with Western and specifically the MEM and MS program. So accessing that, previous fellows had really cataloged those water resources and then really developed this project. And then just like the continued support of Cold Harbor and Bush Clark has really allowed us to go out there and start hopefully implementing and restoring these systems.
And that being said, private landowners in the Gunnison Basin, in my experience, have been just fantastic and very open to working with the university. So if you're interested in that, just go knock on doors, go shake hands, go meet and greet. Because a lot of the ranchers around here have conservation easements, so definitely ready to work with students, and especially if you're motivated. Let's work for them. Kelsey?
I have a question for, other Brennan. So you said that the landowners have really changed their minds about how they want wildlife to be using their lands and kind of the purpose of like their restoration and that sort of thing. Were they like, did somebody go and educate them or reach out to them to try to like change their minds? Did they self-educate? Was it a mixture if they told you?
Yeah, so the question was, there was a kind of a change in how the landowners saw their property, and whether that was facilitated by a person or if it was kind of self-learned. Is that more or less? And so I wouldn't say, maybe I over-exaggerated it. I don't know if they had, they weren't going there just to clear out all the deer from the valley. It's a beautiful area, and they do love the wildlife in the Rocky Mountains. But what was the other half of the question? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm mostly interested in like how, because you said that kind of they migrated, like how they mostly wanted to hunt, and now they're like, oh, I want to restore this beautiful ecological area, kind of back. How did that get facilitated?
They just fell in love with the land. It's a beautiful spot out there. They get to be nice and peaceful out there, and they see all the animals that they're sharing the land with. So I'd say it's more of just an evolving appreciation for the land more than any sort of like deliberate education. More of just a love for the land and wanting to keep it as pristine or upgraded to be as pristine as possible.
Right. Well, let's give a round of applause.